Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Loren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today we're doing a special roundtable episode with me, Loren Richmond Jr., Ryan Panzer, and Jake Doberenz, hosted by Martha Tatarnik. You hopefully know who I am, but for our two guests, Jake Doberenz is a minister, writer, and business owner. Most of his energy goes into Theophany Media, a Christian education company exploring how creativity and technology can help the church teach the Bible better. Jake Doberenz is a polymath, identifying as a writer, teacher, minister, and creative thinker. Jake founded Theophany Media, a Christian education company exploring how creativity and technology can help the church teach the Bible better. He holds 2 degrees from Oklahoma Christian University, a Master of Theological Studies and a Bachelor's in Bible with a minor in Communication Studies. His published work includes plays, nonfiction books, and novels, and he has produced podcasts such as Creatively Christian. Ryan Panzer is the author of Grace in Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture, and The Holy and the Hybrid, Navigating the Church's Digital Reformation. Ryan has spent his career in the worlds of church leadership and technology. He received his M.A. from Luther Seminary while simultaneously working for Google. Ryan serves as a learning and leadership development professional in the technology industry and as a speaker and writer on digital technology in the church. Ryan also serves as the theologian in residence at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Madison, Wisconsin. For more writings and resources, visit ryanpanzer.com. Oh, and a fun fact relevant to the show. This voiceover was done by voiced cloned AI. So, with that in mind, let's jump into the show.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am your guest host this week, Martha Tatarnik, and today I am facilitating a panel discussion on the use of artificial intelligence in the church, including how to use it and how we should be faithfully interrogating its use. The reason why I'm facilitating this week is so that Loren, our regular Future Christian host, can be part of the panel. Now, Loren doesn't really need any introduction, but also on our panel today, we have Ryan Panzer and we have Jake Doberenz. We have had both Jake and Ryan on the show before, so welcome back, Ryan and Jake. It's great to have you on Future Christian today. I think it would be helpful to take a moment to outline for our listeners your ministry context, and maybe Ryan, you can go first.
Good to be here with you all today. I'm someone who has always had one foot in the door of the world of church, one foot in the door of the technology industry, do a lot of learning and development work in the world of tech. In the church, I'm someone who's always thinking about these crossroads of technology and ministry. My congregation at the local level, I serve in a part-time role called the theologian in residence, where my job is to ask big questions about what God is up to in the world and what that means for our response as a local congregation.
That's fascinating, Ryan. Thank you. And Jake, can you tell us a little bit about your ministry context?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in different church roles throughout my life. Right now, I'm doing more pulpit supply, bounces around to different places and preaching on a Sunday morning. Other times, I've done college ministry and associate ministry and youth ministry. I'm also in Christian education, so I am teaching at a Christian school right now and hanging out with some of those youngsters and trying to help them navigate the world and all the big questions.
Awesome. Well, we have quite a few different ministry contexts represented between the three of you. I have to say that I've just been mentioning to a few friends and colleagues about our conversation today being on the horizon. And I think we are really tapping into a live conversation that people just have a lot of questions and a lot of fears and a lot of uncertainty about. So I'm super grateful to all three of you for being willing to engage this conversation in a deeper and very thoughtful way. So getting into our hot topic, artificial intelligence in ministry, as quickly as possible, let's just take a moment to go around the Zoom screen or the studio screen here, and each one of you could share some examples of where you're finding AI useful in ministry right now. Loren, you haven't had a chance to talk yet, so why don't you tell us how you're using AI?
Yeah, let me just say, like, firsthand, like, most likely I'm going to use AI to record a voiceover introduction for this episode. So I've used an AI platform to clone my voice, and since I hate doing voiceovers, I'll have the cloned voice of me do the voiceover introduction for this episode. So I've been using AI a lot more recently, especially in context of this podcast, to do show notes, summaries, things like that. So certainly there's other ways I've used it in ministry, but I don't want to. I'm sure these guys have also used them, so I want to hear their stories too here.
And just if I can kind of summarize, Loren, like you said, you hate doing voiceovers, but is it like primarily a time-saving tool that you're using it for? Would that be like fair?
Right. That's for me what's been most ideal is, like, rather than me feeling like I need to do 3 or 4 takes to get like a good without me stumbling over words, for instance, like I know I can just pop the Word doc or the text into the AI tool and it'll just produce something. You know, it sounds, if you're paying attention, you can tell it sounds a little off, but also, like, when I played samples back to people, they're like, that sounds like you.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
it does,
sure.
It does. And especially like on a day like today where I'm home with kids and dogs and I need to ensure quiet, like I know that AI will do it without too many background interruptions.
Right. Okay, that's good. Jake, how about you? How do you use AI in ministry?
I like to use AI as kind of a brainstorming partner a lot. It can help me get some ideas going, and it can remind me of stories or scripture with kind of very little input. So I could be like, that one scripture about the thing with the other thing, and whatever barely the bare minimum details I give it, it can often give me exactly what I'm looking for, much better than like a Google search kind of thing, which needs those keywords that it's looking for. The AI is a little more intuitive. And then secondly, I love to use it to edit because I hate editing my work. When I write it, I want to be done with it, never see it again for some reason. And so I have built some custom chat GPTs and things like that will edit my work and won't change the style too much and will just make it a little prettier. So I use that for different kind of online content and different things like that. And my faithful and funny newsletter that I put out every week, I make the AI do the editing for me, the text editing, so I don't have to. So a couple of the few ways I mainly use it, AI in my ministry.
Okay, so like some time-saving tools as well, but also offloading some of the jobs that you don't enjoy as much. And then I like that as sort of a conversational companion who has a better memory bank and, better instant recall than we sometimes have. That's good. How about you, Ryan?
Mostly at this point, I'm using AI to repurpose content. So in my ministry role at the congregation, we do a lot of sermon series. And sometimes we'll extend that sermon series with a youth group lesson or a confirmation lesson. And AI is really good at taking a sermon manuscript and repurposing it, creating a lesson plan based on the text of the sermon and the text of the reading that the sermon is based off of. We've also been doing that same thing with blog posts. So we can ask ChatGPT, for example, to write a 300-word blog post based on a 1,500 to 2,000-word sermon. And it's really good at condensing the ideas from that text into something that can be used in maybe an email communication.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that is sort of the epitome, I think, of that artificial intelligence, is that ability to synthesize ideas in similar ways to how our human brain actually works. It's
Certainly
incredible. Yeah. So I think just going around the table, I'm getting a sense about this next question, but what would you each say is most exciting about artificial intelligence, and where do you see the greatest potential and possibility? Like, we know that we're really just on the cusp of all that is going to become possible with AI. So I'm interested in what excites you now and into the future. Who wants to jump in first?
I'd be happy to share a few thoughts on that one. So I'm actually less excited about AI as a productivity booster. I think that's what AI does well right now, but I don't know if productivity is so great of a value that we should put all of our emphasis there. What I'm most excited about when it comes to AI is as a tool or companion for helping us to articulate our story. When we think about articulating a faith story, it seems like this daunting task to so many of us. It involves, first of all, some confidence, having a little background in scripture, maybe a little bit of theology, maybe some coaching from someone who's in a ministry role. AI can take some of that work on alongside of us, and in that way become something of a coach or a companion for helping us to share a cohesive and coherent story of what faith means in the particulars of our life. And I think that vision of using AI to help us articulate stories can be so powerful in a church context.
Well, yeah. I think that isn't the first thing that people think of in terms of AI in ministry. So I love that as an answer. How about you, Jake?
Well, I can't say using it as a productivity tool. My immediate thought was not so much in the productivity tool thing, which I agree is maybe how we think of it a lot, but I think the greatest kind of what I'm excited for the future, rather, is how it allows us to kind of live in our zone of genius, where whatever role you're in, ministry or a different context, there's a lot of the less glamorous, less attractive parts of your work, and AI can kind of take over that. So, whether we call that productivity or whatever, like with the editing or whatnot, the parts I don't like as much, I can outsource that in different ways and focus on the part that I do like, or the part that I really feel God has called me to. And I know a lot of ministers and people in the church have sort of this one reason they got into ministry, this one zone of genius, but then there's these other tasks, administrative stuff, all this other stuff that they can get caught up in, and sometimes that becomes much more of the work than we originally wanted to. So I'm just generally excited about how it can allow us as gifted individuals to lean into that gift, to lean into the things that God has really made us excel in, and be able to sort of outsource or have kind of another tool to help us in the parts that maybe we're not as gifted in or not particularly called to do, if you will.
I'm really struck by that because that's so much the conversation that we have about team ministry, that we want to put ourselves in team situations where we can really lean into our giftedness. And so to imagine AI as being part of how we source that team ministry model, I think is pretty powerful. Sorry, Loren, what were you going to say?
No, I feel like we're getting a lot of crossover, but I was just going to say, like, to me, it's like a third brain or really like a gazillion brains, right? So if it's like, if I'm like in a writer's block scenario, like I've done something where like I've been like, I need a pastoral prayer on this text. And I've edited it a good bit, but it kind of helped me get started. So I can I've always been one where it's like, whether it's feasting on the word or one of these other kind of lectionary prayers or tools, book tools, like I've always used those to kind of get my brain going, and to have something to start with. So I found it helpful for that, that context.
Yeah, like a creativity instigator. That's good. Okay, I have to say, when I've been chatting with my friends and colleagues about today's topic, generally, all of the things that you have just outlined isn't people's first go-to in terms of talking about AI. What I hear is just tremendous fear and uncertainty around AI in the church. So, you guys all have your fingers on the pulse. Where do you see those fears kind of cropping up the most? What do you think it is that people feel most anxious about in the church and in general about AI? And like, to what degree do you think that these fears are founded?
Well, I work with a lot of writers and creatives and the different kind of ministries and podcasts and things that I've done. And creatives are scared about what will be replaced. When AI moves in, what are we losing? And they're scared specifically that losing that ability to create, whether that's there's going to be AI covers, so that means cover artists lose their job, or AI is going to be popping out books left and right, and then there goes all the authors' jobs or something like that. And I think in some cases the right question, with philosophers and theorists like Marshall McLuhan that talks about technology. When a new technology comes on the scene, it replaces something. That's what technology does. It always replaces something we had before, and that's absolutely something we should be concerned about. But when I'm talking to these creatives and things like that, and while, yeah, there's some things to fear, luckily, AI isn't the best ever in the world at some of these more creative things. There's a good chance it'll get there sometime. But right now, we can tell there's 9 fingers on that one guy's hand in the image, and, the story is really flat and boring and, something that might not be as interesting. So there's still room for creatives. And I just encourage them to all the more use those tools to help you tell your story better. Kind of like what Ryan was saying, but in a little different context. There's still a place for the human, and I think we're reaching a point where that might become more valuable to have that human creativity. It's just people fear all that replacement that's going to happen, and it's legitimate, but I think there's still room for the human. We're still going to need what is human, even in this age of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I think that is a big piece of people's concerns, and of course, it's not a new concern, right? Because we see so many technologies that have developed over the last number of generations that have indeed kind of outsourced a lot of human labor that used to provide jobs and kind of all of those pieces of human contribution that just are no longer needed. So I think that the outsourcing can be a slippery slope. But the companion piece can be extremely valuable in terms of extending human creativity. So I think that's important to articulate. Loren or Ryan, do you think that there are other fears out there that we also need to name?
Likely the fear that's been named the most in the media has to do with what Jake just described, which is job displacement, job loss. And indeed, like part of the Hollywood writer's strike was based around the idea that AI would displace screenwriters by generating prompts and coming up with lists of ideas for how to write a new Hollywood script. Ultimately, what AI can do is it can write a C- essay for you. It can write probably a B or B minus type screenplay. What AI struggles to do is to ask the questions that are really intrinsic to the creative process, to frame an issue in a new light, to stand from a new vantage point and interpret a situation. And that's why AI is such an effective assistant, because once we figured out what questions to ask, AI is able to do some of the manual and time-intensive tasks that come with answering that specific question. So while the fear has to do with job displacement, I think the response needs to be, let's train our communities to be really effective in the processes of problem solving, critical thinking, and asking theologically reflective questions. If we can do those things well, AI is unlikely to displace those particular skills. AI can then help us to use those questions for more creative inputs by helping us to arrive at the answers with a little bit more efficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah, and Ryan, you have written some really good articles on like refining that companionship with AI in terms of how the human being can more refine the questions that they ask, the prompts that they give, and the contributions that are sort of unique to our human offering in opposition to AI or in contrast to AI. I guess what I would say, though, in terms of the fears that I am hearing articulated, is that just because artificial intelligence doesn't excel in some of those areas right now doesn't mean that that isn't on the horizon. Like we do seem to be training or creating computers that more and more deeply mimic the way that the human brain functions. And I think that overtaking of the particularly human dimensions of our thinking, I think that's in the ether there right now.
I'm reminded of like some of my favorite like iRobot, or of course like the original Terminator movies, where it's really this kind of ultra intelligence that kind of takes over for humanity's sake and says like, hey, humans are not capable of governing or functioning on their own volition. Like they need some kind of oversight. So I think that's ultimately out there. I think about this when I think about, like, for instance, AI video or the ability to create visual media that's not obviously real life. Like, I was looking at a site that does AI headshots, and I wondered, like, oh, should I do an AI headshot, or is it obvious that that's fake? I think we're seeing some implications already, and I imagine we'll probably see some here in the States before the election in the fall of like AI video of maybe, Biden looking stupid or Trump looking stupid, or, something to that effect that it really kind of diminishes one of the candidates. I think there's already an example, right, of like an AI video or AI photo of Trump with some African American people. So I think, like, in a church context, like I can think about that as a pastor, of just the danger of like someone potentially wanting to cause harm to your community. And with AI, you can produce content at such, like, because of the speed, like, content can be produced, whether it's a diminishing video or a tweet or a post or whatever, that it's almost impossible to respond and refute the evidence with evidence, refute with evidence. That it almost becomes overwhelming, that you just lost to sort of what, to be political for a second here, like what the former president has done, where it's like, if you just keep lying, it almost becomes impossible to refute the lie. So I think that's just thinking, like, from an institutional perspective, as a leader of an institution, that's one kind of a fear I guess I might have of potential for ill actors.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. I think that fine line between, like, what is fake and what is authentically a synthesis of, ideas that are out there? Does that make it fake if it didn't come from a human being versus, is it an extension of our own creative processes? I think those blurred lines become really interesting to sort out. For example, a lot of my friends who are in education, like the current rules around plagiarism don't cover AI because AI is not plagiarism. Like the use of AI to write a college essay, for example, it's not plagiarizing. Like it's original content, and it can be argued that it's in a synthesis of the author's own ideas. So yeah, I think all of those categories get broken down and need to be redefined in particular ways as well.
One of the other challenges that's facing those in ministry work is the perhaps very real threat that people will, instead of taking their questions of faith and spirituality to a pastor or a small group leader, that they'll take them to ChatGPT or Google Gemini. And that is maybe an underrated concern, and one I think we need to be thinking more about. What happens when, instead of asking the questions of doubt or scrutinizing one's faith, somebody just takes those same questions to a chatbot, which is available 24/7, 365. I think in some ways we have to be articulating what to look for when it comes to a chatbot and AI, and how to screen out what's true and authoritative and valid from what merits conversation with a real embodied and hopefully trained and skilled human being.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is kind of the other companion piece to that is, like, are we sort of making relationships a bit redundant, like human relationships in general? If you can have, on one hand, a friend who may or may not be available when you need to talk to them, may or may not be able to actually hear what you're saying and put their own stuff in the background in order to respond in a caring way, versus this constantly available option for being able to get a response that is maybe exactly what you need in that moment, without having to deal with kind of all of the mess and disappointment of human relationship. It's I think valid concerns. But on the other hand, I think that all of you have articulated ways in which AI can actually be clarifying for the life of the church, for the role of the pastor, for the importance of human community. What would you kind of say are the clarifying things about those roles for us in response to AI?
Well, to name one that I'm particularly interested in is it can draw in more sources to our dialogue. If we learn to use AI well, it doesn't just give you one response as the only answer to a question. It can help you to draw on different interpretations, different traditions, and different source material to engage your conversation. When we think about like clarifying capabilities, it's that ability to enrich our understanding through better access to more source material. For example, I just asked a second ago ChatGPT a really interesting theological question coming up for Good Friday. Why did Jesus die? And instead of giving me one perspective, which I thought it might, it actually gave me 5 different answers, giving me more of a widely shared conventional Orthodox point of view, as well as some points of view from post-Christian theology and liberation theology. What would be interesting is to then pursue a train of thought where I ask ChatGPT to clarify those perspectives and maybe even recommend a book or an author or a scholar from each of those perspectives. So I'm really excited about drawing us AI's ability to draw us deeper into some of these really meaningful and big questions that we, to a large extent, just can't answer in and of ourselves.
Yeah, so it kind of expands the limits of the conversations that we would otherwise be having. I like that. Um, you kind of mentioned a minute ago, Ryan, and I'm interested to hear from Loren and Jake on this, like that there's this fear of AI kind of supplanting the role of the pastor. You can just go to ChatGPT instead of going to your pastor about the big questions. But are there ways in which AI makes it more clear what the role of the pastor is? Are there ways in which it actually makes the role of the pastor more necessary?
Well, the first thing that I want to note is that there was actually a study done about how more neurodivergent people would rather talk to a chatbot than a human, which I note in my book as one way that we can utilize AI to expand the reach of the church for people that might not be comfortable in those spaces or something like that. And so I do think that is really interesting. I think that was a study out of the University of Connecticut, I want to say. But then more to your point about how that might kind of clarify the role of a pastor, I am 100% a fan of the local pastor doing what a pastor does, shepherding that local community in ways that they can. And I've already mentioned ways in which it can free up time and get that pastor in that kind of zone of genius where they're doing what they're best at and doing more of the relationship building when people want it. So I have a suspicion that the people that might really want to talk to the human being, given an AI, they're probably still going to choose to talk to the human being. So I think it's expanding some of the reach to the people that might not already want to initiate a relationship with that.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that, and of course I'm thinking about this through the lens of Andrew Root, since I'm obsessed with his work right now. But having just finished The Pastor in the Secular Age, I'm thinking about how the role of pastor as distributor of sacrament, and to Jake's point of clarifying or simplifying the role, it really does allow the pastor to really to just to again use the sacramental language, to be a conveyor of grace. Unless so, I think that's interesting. There's so much overlap, obviously, in what we're saying, but I think it really does simplify, like Jake was saying, about what the pastor needs to do.
Yeah, Loren, I'm also kind of thinking about your conversation with Jay Kim a couple of episodes ago, and he described that difference between information and transformation, and that the transformation being embodied. I wonder to what degree the embodied community of faith, the sacramental, the in-person, the messy, the flawed, kind of all of those pieces just become that much more valuable and essential in the walk of faith. Maybe we have more patience for all of those human shortcomings, because we see how valuable they are.
Part of a congregation that's currently starting the process of calling a new pastor, and we're assembling a ministry site profile, and just finished a large-scale survey of the congregation to identify the top skill and the top need for this new pastor. And over 90% of those survey responses identified preaching and teaching as the number one thing that we would be seeking in this position. One of the challenges with churches these days is people are encountering pastors increasingly, almost exclusively through the pulpit and what's said on Sunday mornings. And at a very practical level, if pastors can use AI to be better teachers and preachers of the word in the setting where they're also administering the sacraments, then that is a fulfilling expression of Christian ordained ministry.
Yeah, I love that. That's really well said. Okay, so let's put some more explicitly theological language to this, or biblical language to this. I think that there is an interpretive lens on all of the most powerful technologies that we've created over the last number of decades, that sees these major breakthroughs in human technology as a sort of Tower of Babel situation. I think that is a biblical story that continues to resonate very deeply into our world today. We often ask how high we can build a tower without asking whether we should build the tower that high. What is dangerous about building the tower that high? So, we're living in a day and age where we can clone human life, where we can alter the genetic code. And with the further development of AI, we're in a very real way, creating consciousness, creating the ability for machines to think in ways that are sometimes indecipherable from how a real human being is thinking. And, in all of those pretty phenomenal technological developments, there aren't always forums for talking about the potential harm that is unleashed on creation when we develop these sorts of technologies. So, what theological lens do you bring to this technology? What would be your response to that Tower of Babel parallel?
Well, I guess as a lifelong Lutheran, I would have to respond to that with Martin Luther's idea of being simultaneously saint and sinner, and how these technologies are created by people who are fully redeemed and also broken at the same time. Our use of these technologies will be uplifting and destructive at moments. It doesn't mean we shouldn't engage the thoughtful use of defining how best to use these technologies and how not to use these technologies. Perhaps that framework of simultaneously saint and sinner is the one that I find continues to scale across all technological developments, because it reminds us that even on the best days, these technologies are still deeply flawed, and even on their worst days, there are still hopeful applications.
Yeah, that's some good nuance, because I think what often limits our ethical wrestling with these kinds of issues is that we tend to have very polarized opinions about whether or not these things should be embraced or resisted. And that saint and sinner offers some really important nuance.
And then just to respond briefly to your comment about consciousness, people disagree with what defines consciousness. There's no universally accepted description of what is consciousness. And even the ability of a computer to imitate a human being deceptively, that's been around since Alan Turing in the mid-20th century. So these questions about at what point does AI become conscious, at what point does it become sentient, these are philosophically loaded conversations that we need to be having. What better to have those better place to have those conversations than in a theologically grounded setting like a church?
Yeah, absolutely. Truly.
So, some of the theological lenses I bring to the table is this concept that we sometimes call plundering the Egyptians, or that's the name I like to use, because it comes back to this idea in Exodus where the Israelites stole / were given the gold of the Egyptians. They plundered them without actually really plundering, and then they took off. And later, some of that gold became used in the tabernacle and then the temple of God. And some of that was probably used for the golden calf. So there's also that aspect of it. But I see that as my approach to technology or the world's inventions is what can we take from the world and then redeem it for good. And so I'm excited about things like new technologies because I think there's a lot of good in there, and we should always be aware of what it takes away and how it could be potentially misused. But let's, quote unquote, plunder the Egyptians. Let's take that gold and turn it into something good in our church spaces. And Christians have always kind of been at the forefront of technology. Even the concept of a book with pages that opens at a spine is a technology that Christians really popularized in the early church, moving from scrolls to codexes to books. And so Christians have always been at the forefront of taking this technology from the world and seeing how can this be used for God, from the printing press to, televangelists, whether you like them or not. We have been doing this for a while. And as long as we're cautious and critical and don't think that things can only be good, because as Ryan pointed out, these are ultimately human inventions, and so they are morally ambiguous. They can go either way. And so we got to be careful. But my approach is, let's take what we can, take the good stuff from it and use that for the glory of God in our churches, in our Christian communities. Let's take that and make the world a bit better.
How about you, Loren?
Yeah, I just kind of piggyback on what Jake is saying. Like, I've lamented, and I continue to lament, like, I'm big, or I really nerd out on, a lot of things, but ethics, for instance, and I am, I guess I'd call myself like a virtue ethicist. I was thinking about, like, recently how, like, in the last year or two, like, NIL, AI, and the NCA, who's the third one? Crypto has asked for, like, government regulation. Like, they've asked for guidance rather than them just being like, hey, we're going to act virtuously and set our own kind of broad principle. So I think that's like an overriding principle that we need to think about, like, what's most virtuous, or we might say what's most Christ-like, what's most godly, rather than because I found again and again when we set like hard, fast rules, like, we can always find a way to go against a rule or read between the lines or feel like, oh, we're not breaking the rules, but like what's most virtuous, and really let that be our guide. What's most Christ-like?
Okay. I mean, all of you have named like the need for caution and carefulness as well. So, like, if you were going to issue one caution to our listeners in embracing AI, what would be the caution that you would offer?
Okay, I'm going to jump in here because I have one that I've been like excited to share, and it goes back to my episode with Jay Kim. Like, he mentioned, he said something about, I think it was a Dallas Willard quote about how, like, when the word leaves the preacher, like, the most powerful thing happens when those words leave the preacher's mouth and enter into the hearer's ears and brain. Like, I wonder, like, does something theological or supernatural happen if those words are coming out of like a computer? If there's like an AI preacher.
Okay, so that's your cautionary question. What about you, Ryan?
I would have two responses. So on the one hand, a caution for those who think they don't need to engage with these tools because they're either not useful or not worthy of use. My caution would be not to sit this out. This is a generationally transformative technology that we are seeing emerge. And the ministries that learn to use this thoughtfully will be the ministries who are likely to be still around decades from now. This is something we can't afford to sit out in the church context. For those who are inclined to use AI, I would have a different caution, which would be to hedge into nuance every output that you see from these tools. One of the great hangups I have with ChatGPT is, of course, that it doesn't cite its sources. So all of everything that we're reading as the output of AI is the product of the average of the internet's commentary on a particular subject. We have to nuance these outputs when we utilize them. We have to put our own interpretive lens on these types of statements. And if we take at face value everything that we're getting, whether it's a text or a visual or video output, in some ways we are beholden to forces that we don't completely understand.
What about you, Jake?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest caution is to, with AI, never forget the human part of the church, of the show. I had a great conversation on the Thinking Theological podcast about this subject. And one of the things that the host, Spencer, brought up that I've been thinking about a lot since then is, well, what if you are outsourcing to AI things that members of your church could do? If you have a graphic design person in your church, is it okay to let AI do that for free in, 3 seconds, create your church logo or whatever you need? And I think that's a valuable point. I think that, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And you talked about that a little bit, Martha, and that's also sort of a Jurassic Park quote, which maybe that's more applicable than we care to admit. But just because we can use AI to do whatever, doesn't mean we always should. And specifically for me, it's when it comes to the human community in the local church. So if I have a local church member whose gifting is graphic design or editing or event planning or whatever, then I think maybe I shouldn't outsource that to AI, even though I could. If a human will volunteer to do that, if they have the skills, I want to make sure they're being able to utilize their gifts. So that kind of comes back to one of those fears I mentioned about replacement. Let's also remember to balance the human as we balance the artificial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I as you're talking, Jake, I again call to mind a recent conversation that I've had around team ministry here in my church context, because I have a new co-rector in our parish. And when we were talking with a coach about how we were going to divide labor between the two of us in our ministry context, one of the cautions that he offered was, you do want to lean into your gifts, but you also don't want to completely outsource to the other person all the things that you find challenging or that you don't like, right? There is something about our own human journey and development that is enriched by having to do some of those things that don't come easily, that aren't our favorites. So I think that would be a caution that I would bring to the AI table too, especially in terms of how we're considering this to be part of that ministry context. Not just we don't want to replace the gifts of another human being, as you say, Jake, who could do that graphic design or that event planning for us, but we don't want to kind of lose out on some of those internal challenges too for ourselves, I think. Okay, so getting into that sci-fi realm, and Loren, you referenced some of those long ago movies that seem more and more either on the nose or a million years away from what has actually transpired. But that question of consciousness is, I think, sort of more and more a reality that's on the horizon. Like, at what point do we ascribe consciousness to machines? At what point do we kind of say, yeah, these human created machines are actually thinking for themselves? I think we have a lot of fears associated with that. I think we have fears around robots being a lot better at running the world than human beings, and suddenly we have the servant becoming the master. But I wonder whether there's a line that we have to identify where we have responsibility toward these thinking machines, and where they also, have a place in God's creation that we need to carefully steward. Any thoughts about those lines around consciousness?
Let me start the conversation just because I was thinking about this, hearing a podcast with Esau McCauley, who talked about the importance of the Imago Dei in his Black church tradition. I'm just thinking about it in this lens, like, we could say, like, God has chosen to create in God's image humans, and it's only humans, at least I believe, that are created in God's image. So God has theoretically entered into this assignment or this agreement with humanity, knowing that we are flawed human beings. And obviously there's some soteriological stuff there too. So, I think about, like, if God wanted to create like us as robots, like, God could have done that. So I think for me, that kind of frames, it's kind of like my framing reference of, like, our humanity is the brokenness and all, as Jake and Ryan have alluded to, is I think something that is distinct and important, and our image bearing of God.
Mm.
Martha, I don't know if there's a particular line in the sand that AI can't be allowed to cross. I don't know. At least I don't know if we could identify that specific point right now. I think what's more important in the short term is to really think critically about what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? And at what point do we ascribe personhood? We almost have to start the conversation with those really big theological and philosophical questions that go back to the ancient tradition. And if only then can we start to answer the question of what are the red lines that AI cannot be allowed to cross.
Yeah, okay. I hear that. Jake, do you want to jump in there?
Absolutely. Because it's something I've thought about. I don't have an answer to, so I'll just spoil alert. There's not an easy answer here. But while I affirm the Imago Dei, I recognize that as science has progressed, there's so many different ways that we've seen how the things that we thought were uniquely human aren't necessarily only for us. So, animals have been seen using tools, and certain animals have something that seems like a language. Animals can be altruistic. We thought that was our thing, but, we see these different things in nature. So I still ultimately think there is something unique about humanity, but we can't really say that, it's this one thing that makes us separate from the beasts of the earth. It's not quite one thing, I don't think. So that's where, as Ryan mentioned, those lines are difficult. Having said all that, when we approach AI, and as it gets smarter and smarter and smarter, I think we have to potentially think about giving it a sort of moral value, even if we don't give it the same, respect as a regular human. Joshua K. Smith writes in his book Robot Theology about this concept of moral patiency. And the idea with moral patiency is whether or not something has a conscience or whatever, we still kind of subscribe to a certain moral value. And so like he uses the examples of, most of us probably agree like kicking a dog is bad. We don't kick dogs. We don't want to abuse animals. And we do draw some lines, right? Because like if I step on an ant, probably nobody's crying about that. But with some of these more higher level creatures, we actually put laws into place. And, if I have a dog and you kick my dog, like we're going to have a problem, So the concept of moral patiency is, we're not talking about, we don't need to know whether the dog has a conscience or anything like that, but we are nice to it. We are still kind. We have an expectation, cultural, perhaps, sometimes legal, but there's this expectation. And I think we might have to apply the same to robots, whereas we at least respect robots enough where kicking a robot is bad. Maybe if you kick your Roomba, I'll forgive you, but as things get more advanced, I do think we need to think, like Joshua K. Smith is talking about in his book, we have to think about respecting them as if they had some level of moral conscience, whether or not they do, because we can't really peek inside and point to the conscience, but there's still maybe a relationship we need to have, whether or not that's a thing.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the line in the sand that I am thinking about the most is, at what point do we ascribe rights to robots? At what point do we understand that we have responsibility toward how they are treated, as we have responsibility toward other creatures that share in our labor and are part of our lives and our families and our relationships? I think that those questions are seeming less and less abstract as we get further and further along the development of what artificial intelligence is actually capable of. Okay, well, let's take a break at that juncture, and we'll come back with some rapid fire questions. Well, welcome back to the Future Christian Podcast. We're going to wrap up with our AI in Ministry panel with a few rapid fire questions. And maybe we'll start with Loren and work our way around the screen here. Okay, my life would be dramatically altered without this technological device.
I was trying to think of something else besides my phone, so I decided on my smartwatch. I have a Garmin that makes it really handy when I'm going out for a run or a bike ride or things like that at the gym, workout suggestions. So I really like my Garmin smartwatch. It wouldn't be drastically altered without it, but it is a really nice convenience that I like to utilize a lot.
Yeah, the watch and the phone, those are good answers. How about you, Jake?
Well, yeah, it's hard to not say phone. Absolutely. Phone is an obvious one, of course, and that's immediately what I thought. More specifically on that, I'll say earbuds and earphones and things like that, because I like my music and my podcasts and my audiobooks and all that kind of audio stuff. So that would alter my life, because how could I do dishes if I couldn't listen to anything? I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, for sure. Ryan.
Can I go really old school and reference something Jake said earlier and just go with books? If I had to lug around a codex or a scroll every time I wanted to read something new, it would really be tedious. So the fact that we have bound books that are relatively portable certainly makes conversations like this more fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would definitely say something about being a music lover and being able to access an entire expanding library of music just in one little file on my phone, rather than having to have 18 boxes of CDs, although I do still have the 18 boxes of CDs sitting in my basement. Okay, if I were to unplug for 24 hours, I want to spend my time doing this. You're taking a technology fast. What are you going to do with your time? Jake, you can go first this time.
I would write by hand, which is not my favorite thing to do, but I would definitely want to practice more. Remember what it's like to write something long form without the use of a computer. And my goal in 2024 is to do some kind of monastic-like retreat, silent technology-free retreat thing. So I hope to actually get some writing on paper done.
Wow, I can feel the blisters on my fingers coming back just as you say that. I used to get those crazy blisters on my hands from writing out essays in high school. Ryan, how about you?
I might take some time to play an instrument. With how busy life has gotten lately, I don't often play the guitar or the piano or the trombone like I used to. And if I didn't constantly have email and Slack and WhatsApp to keep up with, I might do those things more frequently. I suppose I should also say I would spend a lot of quality time with my wife and kids, of course. But I would also probably play some music.
Yeah, you definitely want to get the family in there for sure. Loren, how about you?
This is technically a technology if we're going by Ryan's standards, but I'd love to mountain bike. I live within relatively easy driving distance to the mountains, yet, like Brian alluded to, like getting out there is real tough. So it's technically a mountain bike is a technology, but it's not the kind of technology we're talking about, I guess, right?
Yeah, we did say unplugged. Yeah. You can definitely use your mountain bike. Yeah, I like the idea of spending some time playing the piano. I would definitely read quite a bit as well, but lots of options for what to do with the technological fast. Okay, and finally, I most want the church to keep this in mind as we go forward in our human AI partnership. What are just some summary statements from our conversation today that you would want the church to hear the most? Loren, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I'm just gonna stay on what I said about the preaching thing. Like, I think there's something profound about the Holy Spirit's interaction with the human during the sermon prep, during the delivery, and then during the human hearing and receiving the message. That I think there's something sacred and, dare I say, supernatural in that. So not that utilizing AI isn't, not that it shouldn't be done, but also, like, I wouldn't want to just like to put in a text, have it create an entire message, and then just me read that text, or even have an AI voice, deliver a message. To me, that would be missing out on something.
Ryan.
Where my mind first jumped to was how singularly focused we tend to be about the narrative of the church in decline and declining attendance figures. And I would just remind us that it's not your job individually to solve that challenge, nor is it the job of AI to solve that challenge. God shows up through word and sacrament, and that's sufficient.
What about you, Jake? Closing thoughts?
I would say always remember what technology extends. When it extends, it also diminishes something else. It atrophies a part of what it means to be human. So we should never lose sight of when there's advantages, there's going to be disadvantages, but we can mitigate that by thinking critically about these technologies and being careful but how we use it to extend so that we don't diminish things that make us so uniquely human and children of God.
Yeah, I think as we're wrapping up this conversation, I think what I would most want our listeners to hear is the call to continue this conversation, because I'm really struck by just how in the however many minutes that we've been talking, I think that we've identified tons of issues and really only just begun to explore how we tease out the answers and how we discern our way forward. I'm also just incredibly aware of how much this technology is evolving. And so the conversation is going to be a moving target. So I really, really hope that our listeners will kind of take the responsibility of creating those forums in ministry contexts and in the life of the church to be talking about this very seriously, prayerfully, putting the fears out there and using kind of all of our human resources and our spiritual resources to talk through our way forward. I think it was Jake, you who said, it was either Jake or Ryan, what better place than the community of the church to be having these kinds of conversations. So I really hope our listeners will take that seriously. Okay, Ryan and Jake, where can people find you and follow your work and learn more and read more and engage more?
Well, you can follow me at the website, www.ryanpanzer.com. I wrote a book a few years ago called Grace in Gigabytes, Being the Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture. And in some ways, I feel like it's become more relevant since it was published, and would certainly welcome anyone to reach out via my website to further the conversation.
Yeah, and you put out a newsletter pretty regularly that
usually about once a month. Yeah,
offers some further takes on the evolving conversation. So I recommend that very much. How about you, Jake? Where can people find you?
I also have a website that is just my name, jakedoberenz.com. If you don't know how to spell that, hopefully Loren spelled it right in the show notes, so you can go there, jakedoberenz.com. I wrote the book, AI in Church and Ministry, Applications of Artificial Intelligence for Faith Communities. So that just came out, where I tried to explore some different potential uses of this technology. And I also have a newsletter as well, called Faithful and Funny. You can find that over on Substack, jakedoberenz.substack.com, where I send a weekly email with a funny story with some kind of spiritual point. And I do talk about technology every so often.
Awesome. We'll check that out. Okay, well, we always end our Future Christian podcasts with a word of peace. So the peace of God be with each of you. And thank you so much for your wisdom and insight today.
And also with you.
And also with you.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian podcast. To learn more about Loren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.